Hello, this is Alex Bryant. Welcome to the EWA Chemical Industry in China webinar. We've got a lot of good information to cover today, but a few housekeeping items. We welcome any questions during the webinar. You can type in the questions on your box, send them to me, and I will then ask the speakers. Secondly, we will be no longer than an hour. We definitely will end on time. If we finish without getting to all the questions, then Dan McLeod, who's director of the EWA Chemical Practice, Jay Honig or myself will respond directly to you. We will be forwarding a hyperlink of the presentation and a webinar recording, which are both stored in our warehouse. We'll be forwarding that to you within the next 48 hours once the recording is up on the webinar. Lastly, we will be sending out a notice in February. We've got our next webinar in March with the EWA chemical teams doing a roundtable regarding specialty chemical industry in Asia Pacific. So for those individuals who are not familiar with East West, I'll make this section pretty quick. We are an operations and consulting firm, and all the EWA executives who work with us have all lived on the ground and had P&L responsibilities for running Western multinational companies in each of the 4 geographic locations where we serve, which is China, Asia Pacific, Mexico, and Central Eastern Europe. Of our core practices today, we'll be specifically addressing the chemical industry in China for Western chemical companies with operations and sourcing on the ground in China. We'll be focusing on the challenges the Western companies are facing in China. Services addressed today of these 9 will be business assessment, manufacturing footprint optimization, supply chain optimization, and strategic business planning. I am Alex Bryant. I'll be moderating the event today. And we've got Jay Honig and Dan McLeod. Dan is the director of the EWA Chemical Practice, and he and Jay work specifically with our chemical manufacturing clients and sourcing clients on the ground in China and Asia Pacific. So Dan, if you would take a minute and give a background of your chemical experience on the ground in China and Asia Pacific.
Sure, Alex, thanks. I've spent nearly 40 years in the chemical industry. Started with Hercules Incorporated and through some other companies, Ashland in particular, working first in the US, but in the late 90s moved to Shanghai to help set up an operation there. My background's primarily in operations management, supply chain management, and engineering design construction projects, and have supervised operations and projects in China, Indonesia, India, Korea, Taiwan, throughout the region. Spent 21 years in Asia, majority in China, but also time in Singapore and the Philippines.
Dan, you with Hercules and Ashland Specialty?
Yes, and also have done some project management, engineering, consulting work in Shanghai as well.
Great, thank you, Dan. Jay, would you also provide a brief background on yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I've got about 45 years in industry, primarily in the large capital projects business with Bechtel and Fluor. I've been operating in China since '89. The last few years, I was chairman of a risk management firm where we had quite a few Fortune 100 companies, Fortune 200 companies that were in the chemical business.
That's terrific. All right, thank you so much. All right, we'll now turn it over to Dan, and Dan, you will set the pace for the rest of the event. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them, and we'll get that to the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges that have arisen in the last several years, specifically towards chemical companies operating or sourcing in China. These trends have been apparent for some years now, but the impacts have been exacerbated by COVID. The difficulty traveling and communicating and interacting on the ground for multinational companies in China has become more pronounced in the last year. We look at some of the key challenges that the industry's been facing. We break it up into 2 blocks, what we would consider a government-initiated set of issues and market-driven. On the government side, the last 5+ years have seen an increase in environmental regulation compliance and issues surrounding that for companies operating. And this is across the board, where really trying to combat industrial pollution and improve the living environment in China. As a result of that, you've seen increased regulatory activity and in many cases a more confrontational relationship between regulators and the chemical industry. That's resulted in either short-term shutdown of operations of your own operations, shutdowns of your suppliers, or in some cases companies being forced to relocate. Related to that, there's been a move towards industry consolidation in China. Some of this is being directed by market forces, some of it being directed by some of the environmental pressures, as smaller companies aren't able to adapt to changing regulations. But there's also policy issues at play here, where central government policy is to promote certain winners in the state enterprise sector, and with them support their acquisition. So you see a general consolidation in the industry. On the market side, we've seen over the last 10 years a slowing economy in China. After a brief significant dip last year with COVID, you've seen a strong response in the economy. But in general, looking forward, the growth rates are going to be 5%, 6% a year in China versus the double digits that we saw 10 years ago. And with that, increased competition from local manufacturers. As the technology improves, as the market understanding improves, as the management capability of these companies improve, they're becoming formidable competitors to multinationals, and consequently you see struggle to fill your factories and driving down margins. Next slide, please, Alex. A couple of graphics to illustrate some of these points. See on the left the number of chemical companies operating in China. After a recovery from the 2008-2009 recession, you saw a steady increase for a few years, and then much in part to the environmental regulatory regimes, we've seen a reduction in the number of companies, and this is 6, 7, 8% reduction in number of companies year over year since the mid-teens, and we're seeing that continuing now. On the right, you look at chemical market growth. The chemical market in China is twice the US, twice the EU, so it's the largest market by far. 15 years ago, the growth rate was approaching 20%. You see this dropping off, and now forecast for the next few years being forecast even lower than the GDP growth in China, where as some overbuilding of capacity is coming to pass, and so see a reduction in that growth. Likewise, you see a number of headlines as you go through the press, some of the articles that you see talking about cracking down on the chemical industry. Mentions Jiangsu province, where there's a high concentration, just west of Shanghai, high concentration in the industry, but it's also had its share of serious incidents that's driving regulatory activity in the last couple of years. And also you see more discussion of M&A activity. M&A really dried up across all industries last year, certainly in the first half, but by the fourth quarter, you saw things starting to change and activity pick up, particularly where companies may need to restructure or find themselves in a very different position to be able to compete following COVID. Next slide, please, Alex. Interesting graphic around forecasted M&A activity. Takeaway here is that some uncertainties have put some companies in precarious financial position. Those that are highly reliant on, for example, automotive and aerospace, in addition to general manufacturing, would be may be challenged and may need to either combine or get rid of some assets. And you can see the paints and coatings industry particularly has been somewhat fragmented and quite a bit of M&A activity the last few years. Expect that to continue. And plastics processing, which is got a pretty diverse number of players in the market, and there's been quite a bit of M&A activity over the last few years, but we expect that to continue. Next slide, please, Alex. So coming back to our graphic, I want to talk a little bit about tactics that we've seen successful companies use to try to manage the impacts from some of these government-initiated activities, particularly around increasing environmental and safety regulatory pressures and industry consolidation. How do companies, what tactics and approaches companies take to manage that? Next slide, please. One of the major issues that we hear frequently about and have worked with a number of clients on, they've been affected by the shutdown of their key suppliers, and it may be a direct supplier or even back tier 2, tier 3 from them. And although they feel that they're doing a good job managing their operations in China, they've been impacted by their suppliers. And this is also certainly a case for companies in the US that are sourcing significantly from overseas and from China, and they're seeing regular disruption. Part of these certainly driven by COVID disruption last year, but this has been an ongoing building trend prior to that, and much of it related to environmental regulation and industry consolidation in China. Next slide. What we see the more successful progressive companies doing is really ramp up their supplier development, supplier interaction programs, where they're emphasizing supplier audits and assessments, on-site assessments, and taking on much of that responsibility themselves and not subcontracting large parts of that out. And to really focus on safety and environmental compliance issues, previous enforcement action, and as I mentioned earlier, both their primary suppliers and maybe the key vendors to those suppliers. So assessments are key. Also seeing an uptick in investigation activity to try to understand the background of your suppliers in more detail. And this can be a bit of a challenge in China and other emerging economies. But what we like to focus on is company reputation and particularly ownership. It's not unusual to find suppliers that would appear to be competitors, but there's some cross ties, either business-wise or ownership-wise, that provides a conflict of interest. And as a customer, you're not quite sure who you're dealing with or how independent the pricing you're seeing is from multiple suppliers. And then, of course, looking at the environmental and safety enforcement actions to get an assessment of how vulnerable those suppliers may be to shutdown or action. And once having established those contacts and regular contacts, we've seen multinational companies then begin to work with identifying where they can help improve the performance of some of their key suppliers and work with them over a long-term process, particularly around environmental and safety compliance, where they may have more sophisticated management systems than they can work with their suppliers on.
Dan, we had a question real quick before we leave that slide. The question was, what is the purpose of the covert investigation? How do you conduct it?
Well, you can do some things certainly online for readily available public information, phone calls to local government and regulators and around their area. We typically work through a network of former police and security services that can go a little deeper, particularly around the ownership. they've got access to information and contacts that the normal person wouldn't have, and we look for them to, when we really try to go deep on the background, particularly the ownership structure of the companies.
And the concern there is that one owner of a company will own several other companies.
Or either own or be tied in with, yes. Next slide, we talk about some of the, when you do a supplier assessment, what are the things that crop up commonly? Well, environmental and safety management systems, certainly. Do your suppliers have a good program for managing compliance? This is required by Chinese regulations and pretty sophisticated and clear guidance on what's required. And implementation of those can be spotty at best, so that's an area we focus on. And we also find problems with general facility maintenance, particularly around wastewater treatment systems and air emissions control and various pollution control equipment. It's an area where if a company hasn't focused adequate attention on preventive and predictive maintenance on those systems and testing of those systems, they can run afoul of regulators. And then also what we look at is the relationship. We like to look for a relationship between the supplier and their local regulators. Do they know each other? Do they have conduits in those organizations? Do they have a way to understand and evaluate what regulations might be coming down the road at them before they're expected to comply? Supplier replacement is certainly another area that we see clients pursue, and this may be as a result of having serious concerns about, after an assessment or an audit of your suppliers, serious concerns about their viability, or it may be that you're sole sourced and simply want to have additional options. Supplier replacement is very much identification and qualification. Working with procurement professionals on the ground, we can help clients identify suppliers, alternative suppliers with the technical and reliability and the ease and experience of working with multinational customers. Very often, again, develop programs to improve those suppliers, ongoing auditing, ongoing measurement and reporting of KPIs, ongoing environmental compliance assessment. Some clients look at establishing a new sourcing office, very much, and that could be very much related to the size of your spend or to the criticality of your suppliers. Do you want somebody close by to manage, monitor, and continually evaluate and extend your supplier qualification capabilities? And we mentioned covert and overt, which we recommend for conducting before taking on any new suppliers of significant volume or criticality to your operation.
Dan, one question popped up. Question was, how has M&A due diligence changed in the last 2 years, particularly with suppliers?
A couple of things that come to mind. One would be more emphasis these days on understanding the relationship between your supplier and their local regulators. Do they have do they know each other? Do they talk to each other? Do they have a collaborative relationship? Have they had issues in the past? That's become a bigger part of the focus of a supplier investigation in the past for due diligence. And additionally, an awareness that some third-party assessments that have been done in the past, looking at those with a higher degree of skepticism. The industry around selling favorable third-party assessment in China has grown substantially in the last decade. So you need to be concerned and be able to validate some of the findings from previous assessments and not necessarily accept those at face value.
All right.
Turn it over to Jay to talk about some other aspects of shutdown and relocation.
Good, thanks, Dan. Yeah, let's, I think as Dan described, if you could summarize that, if you will, you need to stay involved and engaged with your suppliers to understand where their vulnerabilities are. You certainly don't want to be surprised with one of your suppliers being shut down for compliance reasons. Let's turn our attentions to your own facilities. Now, whether you have one facility or multiple process plants in China, there's really two components of what we're seeing in the marketplace relative to government regulations. I think Dan described pretty clearly the issues of consolidation of the industries and really forcing companies into regulated chemical industrial parks. We've got two issues, I think, and let's look at, if you look at the right-hand box, a forced relocation. That typically happens to older plants that have been in China for a couple of decades. They built it out in the countryside, and of course now if they're anywhere near a major metropolitan area, it's being overtaken by urban redevelopment and housing and so forth and so on. And the government wants for those chemical plants to be relocated. They don't want the safety issues involved to be anywhere near housing areas. So from that standpoint, a forced a closure and relocation is going to happen, and I don't think there's many options to that, quite frankly. The other side of that is the, if you will, go back, Alex, to the other one, is the temporary shutdown, and this could be voluntary on your part. It could be required by regulators. But the key issue here is you want to be on the offensive. You don't want regulators coming to the front gate and saying, we're here to do a compliance audit on your facility and not knowing what to expect. So we strongly recommend that you understand your operations and do an assessment of your facilities. Next slide. You really need to do a comprehensive look at your facilities, your production processes, particularly your waste management, your pollution streams, those types of issues relative to the physical assets of the plant, but also understand what your license, your business license actually says. What are you permitted to manufacture? And then what relationships do you have with regulators and government personnel in your local area? And like any risk assessment, you want to identify those risks. You want to categorize them, high, medium, low, or number. Do it on a number basis, whatever. And then for each one of those risks, you want to make sure that you've got some mitigation efforts in place, and start, whether it's whether you can do that while you're continuing to operate. It really depends on the issues that you're having to deal with. In some cases, an audit might uncover areas that regulators will actually have you shut down and fix that or remedy that situation. And again, a lot of this has to do with material handling, hazardous operations, hazardous materials, pollution, obviously emissions, air, water, solid waste handling, those types of things. Next slide, please. So what are the things that we typically see? By and large, it's environmental and hazardous operations. Are there regular procedures in place? Are you in compliance with industry standards and local and municipal and even provincial levels? And what we see many times is a failure to understand the growing and changing requirements, regulatory requirements. You may have for the last 5-10 years been able to produce a certain product with certain chemicals. Now that may have changed, and if you're not really plugged in and communicating with the regulators, you're not going to catch that until they're at the front gate. Remedial action and solutions, I think, are obviously very focused on, again, the same issues: environmental, safety, hazardous material handling, and those types of issues. So we see that this needs to really be done in an independent manner. If your facility has the resources to do this and be objective about it, so be it. If not, you may want to bring in some people from the outside, whether that's from your other operations or headquarters or through a third-party consultant. It really needs to be an objective look at the operations. Next slide. Well, what about customers? Obviously, if you're being shut down voluntarily or involuntary, how do you deal with customers? Several suggestions that we've seen in the marketplace, and in some cases is quite common. The oil, gas, chemical industry is looking at product swaps. Just negotiate with another producer, if you will, for a period of time, and or identify a contract manufacturer that can sort of plug the holes and support your customer, serve your customer until you get your modifications done and are back in compliance. It's going to take months to do this, 2, 3, 4, 5 months maybe. So you want to, again, suggest that you be proactive and make sure that at least you have something planned out on how you might execute this situation should it happen. Next slide. So again, if you look at sort of summarizing the supplier side that Dan talked about, or your own operations, there's going to be a major impact. And how you do that, how you prepare for that is really key. The factory relocation, that's another ball game altogether. Hopefully you can negotiate with regulators for a certain time frame that allows you to go ahead and expand and find a new facility and all of the issues that go with that. But that's a year probably at a minimum before you can bring another facility online and serve your customers. Next slide. Let me turn it back to Dan.
Okay. Thanks, Jay. So talk a little bit about sort of the market-driven cost pressures, market pressures that companies are facing, adapting to lower growth rates in the economy, adapting to increased local competition. All of these can drive down revenue, squeeze your profits. So we look at two sides of this coin. Look on the top line, growth development, and then many options for cost and efficiency improvements. We talk about growth development. It's typically see companies start with is a what you would call a commercial assessment, really looking at the effectiveness of how you go to market, your product offerings, your pricing strategy, your distribution networks, your technical service support. All of these come into play. Which markets are you competing in? Are there other opportunities, adjacencies, adjacent markets that you may be able to compete with? And the ultimate outcome of that is to look for opportunities to grow your business, to grow the revenue stream, and more effectively, efficiently, and lower cost service those customers in the field. Next slide, please. Some of the areas that we've seen emphasized recently that may not come out, that may not be emphasized in some traditional commercial assessments, is the idea of expanding into newer adjacent markets. And this is particularly important in China, where many companies have set up application and formulation facilities to adapt their products to the Chinese market and the specific requirements of the Chinese market. Seen this a lot in personal care and cosmetics manufacturers in particular, but generally across the board. So it could be how to adapt your product to a Chinese market, or also look at adjacent verticals similar enough that perhaps you haven't tried to sell into before, but look like a good fit for the local domestic market in China. The distribution strategy, see more companies in China looking at this. How do you go to market? What's the appropriate mix of direct or through distributors, through agents? And really in the last 3 or 4 years, the boom in e-commerce in China, facilitated by a number of high-profile companies, Alibaba and WeChat enterprises. In the area where this becomes particularly important, we've seen and been involved in a number of projects is post-acquisition, really trying to understand the distribution channels and how do you integrate the distribution channel of an acquired company with the acquiring company, and how to is there a need to unravel particular relationships with distributors and agents to simplify it.
Dan, we had another question popped up. It was what's the purpose of the distribution strategy, but what's the purpose of reevaluating, and how would you go about evaluating a distribution strategy?
Well, generally you look at you segment your product offerings, you look at where you're going direct, where you're going through distributors or agents, and determine if that still makes sense. Depending on the growth of your business, and certainly through this century, since WTO, many companies have grown substantially, and they may have outgrown their original distribution model and need to be evaluated. And as I mentioned earlier, either post-acquisition, there's often a need to reevaluate and take pretty substantial steps to streamline that. The second area of the improvement is around cost and efficiency, and this is really looking around operations management. So the 4 key areas that we see and focus on are operations, which wide variety of manufacturing and supply chain operations, organizational assessments and organization redesign, an area that we found a number of opportunities with clients, a manufacturing footprint assessment, where we look at where manufacturing warehousing facilities are located globally in the markets they serve, and an overall supply chain assessment. Next slide, Al. We talk about an operational assessment, a number of areas you can look at, and some of these may be more important for the particular situation you find yourself in. manufacturing process optimization, whether it's applying lean techniques or improved statistical process control through Six Sigma. Those are pretty classic and pretty commonly done in an area of focus. Planning processes. We've found opportunities, particularly in emerging economies where business has grown rapidly, their ability to plan, the processes they use to plan incoming raw materials, production planning, distribution planning, logistics planning. Businesses have often outgrown that either through the organic growth or through acquisition. So that's an area that's often focused on. And operability improvement in the chemical industry is a critical issue, where particularly if you've got high capital investment, maximizing the uptime, maximizing the availability of those assets are very often a cost-effective way to unlock capacity, much more cost-effective than investing in expansion. Next slide, please, Alex. And organizational assessment is another key area that we look at. And this could be the design of your organization. Does your organization fit the way that the work needs to flow? Organizations for many companies in China have typically been very traditional, very department oriented, very siloed, not a lot of cross communication, and that may not be the best fit for your organization. So you really want to look at the design. Compensation and retention are very closely related, making sure you're staying current with market pay expectations and the non-monetary aspects of employee retention would include training programs and incentives and coaching. And interim management often comes into play if there's an issue, a need for restructuring. Do your senior managers have the capability and experience to do that, or many companies find that they need to bring in specialists to help them through that rough spot? Both the interim management pieces and employee training, for example, have been challenged by COVID and the difficulty and the restrictions around travel. You can't get people in to help train, for example, or to get your folks from China back to the headquarters to engage in training and development there. Those aren't options anymore, and many companies have struggled with that. And in the case of a requirement for interim management or short-term management needs, you're pretty much limited to folks you can bring in that are already residing in China. Bring in from headquarters or regional offices aren't a possibility at this point.
Dan, we have one question there, which around the question says, what type of issues are you trying to address with organizational redesign?
Really around smoothness of workflow, communication, aligning KPIs and performance requirements with people in the organization they work with. As I mentioned, if you've got and this comes to play very often is when you're looking at supply chains, when you've got your sourcing people, your logistics people, your manufacturing people, your customer service people, all reporting in different parts of the organization and all working off different KPIs and performance measurements, then that it's hard to get anything done. And those are typically some of the things we deal with.
Thank you.
Turn it over to Jay for a couple more operations.
Yeah, let's look at the footprint, if you will. Whether you have one facility or multiple facilities in China, I think the issue is you're looking for cost cutting or you're looking for efficiency improvements. So that, I think, leads you to take a very, very hard look at your physical assets and where they're located. So you want to rationalize those facilities, and in some case you may want to consolidate. It doesn't necessarily mean just cost cutting. You might want to expand an existing operation to take into account economies of scale, or having having a larger plant. But if you're expanding geographically, obviously the cost of logistics and freight and what have you, shipping long distances to customers, that can really affect the bottom line. So possibly you want to look at expansions. And then for a lot of our clients, they've been in China for a long time. You'll see it, one of the case studies really focuses on this. Their plant was really over, they went in through Hong Kong and they're into mainland, and their facility was basically taken over by urban renewal. They couldn't expand. So ultimately they had to close the plant. So that's a typical scenario that we're seeing more and more. And of course, the time frame, if you've got to look at a greenfield plant, is going to take some time, as we talked about. And it's not just the design and the building of the plant, but it's all of the tangential issues that go along with that, and that is hiring new management for the plant, new employees, new workers, finding local suppliers, and so forth. So I think looking at your footprint, either to consolidate or rationalize what you've got, or to expand is something that really is important when you're looking down the road to the future. Next slide. We talked a lot about suppliers, and we focused on consolidation and replacement and obviously supplier development. I think one of the issues that I think we've all learned relative to COVID, and that is how dependent are you on one particular supplier. So I think diversification of your supplier base is really key. And as Dan said, continual engagement and assessment of those suppliers to determine their vulnerability that could affect your supply chain. So with that, next slide. Let's go into some case studies.
Jay, before we leave that real quickly, a question's popped up. Says, how often do you suggest recompeting supplier contracts?
Well, I think Dan touched on it. I think any time that you have a major change in your buy, so to speak, I think it's important that you go out into the marketplace. Anytime those procurement conditions have changed significantly, I think it makes sense. I think it's cost competitive. Even if you're not making major changes, you might want to, on a multi-year basis, decide that you're going to recompete and let the marketplace dictate the pricing of the products or materials and what have you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to do one case study and then turn it over to Dan. He's going to do a couple of more. Again, we had an engagement with a client who early on built a facility down in Guangdong, in the greater Guangzhou area, back in the 90s. And over time, as China opened up, more and more of their customer base, as well as their suppliers, sort of migrated into the YRD area. So our client asked us to really look at how they can best address the situation. They were concerned that they couldn't expand because they were being basically overtaken by urban sprawl. They weren't permitted to expand, yet their business was growing significantly. So And of course, their new clients were all up in the east, in the Pearl and the YRD area. So I think it became very obvious very quickly to both us and the client that we wanted to look up in the YRD area for a suitable site. They were also concerned, quite frankly, that their Guangzhou area facility was going to be shut down due to tightening of the regulations. So what we did, we looked at a series of sites, probably well over a dozen, in the greater Shanghai to Nanjing area, looking for appropriate chemical parks. We preferred a national level, and did the necessary due diligence on land cost and so forth. And key to it also was the incentives. What sort of tax incentives we were able to secure on behalf of the owner. We wanted a professional park that had a long track record of stability with respect to utilities and wastewater management and those types of things.
Jay, we had a question just asked, explain it on national level business chemical parks versus provincial level. I think that's what they're asking.
Well, there's a series of different. There's a national level. There's a provincial level. There's a municipal and district level, and then there's all others, so to speak. And the national level parks, I think really, for those of you familiar, there's the Nanjing Park, there's the Shanghai Industrial Park. They were geared more towards large, multi-$100 million chemical plants. So one of the challenges actually we faced was to find a park that was national level, yet would accept considerably smaller capital investment and needed a smaller site. But fortunately, we did find one, and the project did move forward. It was a rather successful engagement, if you will. If you looked at the economics of it, obviously we had a great incentive package. But as far as the operational savings, we reduced the projected reduction of the freight and warehousing costs by over $500,000. Inventory cost reductions were $1 million range, and the overall utilities and environmental labor issues all were offered some significant savings. So all in all, it was a very straightforward engagement, but also very successful for the client. So let me turn it over to Dan.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Jay. A couple of the case studies. One related to logistics, or a couple of these related to supply chain, and the first one on logistics. And the client was a specialty chemical manufacturer that had a single site in China, was covering the entire country. And they'd grown well. They'd grown well since they'd set up, and their customer base had also geographic. And they to support their customers, they prided themselves on fast deliveries and having material available on short notice. They were carrying extremely high inventories in a series of satellite warehouses around the country. But despite that, they were still carrying excessive amount of inventory, and their on-time delivery performance was extremely poor, and they were having to express ship, use expedited freight for about 60% of their shipments. And so this was adding cost, and delivery performance was not very good. And East West began to work with them on looking at their logistics and their inventory management practices and see if we could improve their situation. In our assessment, a couple of key findings from the assessment. They were using way too many carriers. They were using more than 50 carriers, and they didn't have critical mass with any one in particular, so they didn't have leverage. They didn't have any comprehensive contractual arrangements that with an understanding of service level. The planning processes they used, whether it was raw material management, reorder raw materials, production planning, logistics, staging of inventory. These were rather manual, people dependent rather than systems dependent, so not particularly effective. And then we talked earlier about organization. This was very much an indication of an organization not being set up to support an end-to-end supply chain requirements. It wasn't under a single leader, and there was not shared KPIs and performance indicators. So next slide, Alex. So East West was assigned an interim supply chain manager to take over and really to help through transition. One key part of this was logistics management. We identified a single carrier that could handle 80% of their loads and work with them, collaborate with them on performance expectations, KPI reporting, service expectations. We worked on organization design, both to assess the capabilities of the people in place and how they were aligned from a compensation and accountability standpoint. And then looked at their planning processes around forecasting and inventory management, reduction planning, to make them less people dependent, less manual, and more systems generated. And the results, in a matter of months, we were able to reduce their freight and warehousing costs by about $300,000 annually, reduce the number of expedited shipments substantially, increased on-time deliveries to up over 90%, and cut the inventory nearly in half by almost $2 million. So pretty successful and a lot of cash generated in a short period of time.
Dan, question popped up about on the inventory reduction. How did that happen?
It was really mostly around your planning, their planning processes. They had and it was great from really starting with focusing on forecasting, putting in some new but pretty basic sales and operation planning discipline, and then that would allow us to cascade that through production planning and raw material planning. And within a year, it cut those inventories in half.
All right.
Second case study, you have to be identifying a contract manufacturer. And the client was, again, a specialty chemical company, had multiple sites in operation in China, but about 25% of their business in China was based on imports from primarily the US, other operations in the US. They've been growing well, in particular one product line had been growing rapidly at 20% per year. They were having a difficult time supporting that business from US production, the long lead times and the inflexibility in the demand planning created some issues for them. And then 2 years ago, with the implementation of trade tariffs into China, they were taking a big hit from an operating cost, from a product cost standpoint. So East West was brought in to help them work through a decision on whether to produce the product themselves or continue to import, or to go outside to a third party to contract manufacturing. And after the analysis, we looked at and decided upon contract manufacturing, really to get them in business faster so they could enjoy some savings faster and minimize the capital investment that would be required for getting into business. Next slide, Alex. So implementation East-West, we were engaged to identify and qualify suitable contract manufacturers. So we were looking at certainly the quality and technical capabilities, but also their familiarity with working with multinationals, Western companies, and their ability and procedures around IP protection. and their willingness to either had the appropriate equipment or willingness to share the cost of capital investment and recover those costs over some period of time. We have a sourcing specialist in Shanghai, a long history in chemical sourcing in China, and worked with him to identify suppliers of key raw materials in the domestic market, and through this provide a project manager to everything from developing contracts through technology transfer and to startup. As a result, we minimized the capital cost. It was saved $2 million versus installing facilities in an owned facility. Achieved the cost savings from reduced import freight and tariffs costs, and by shortening supply times, it reduced inventory by about $1 million. And this was done on a pretty short-term crash basis, and we got them up and running in 4 months.
Dan, a question popped up is what is with COVID and with the slowing economy, what is the biggest difficulty of finding, I think they mean chemical contract manufacturers?
Well, the biggest difficulty is really having local resources. It's many companies have struggled. You can't bring your technical experts in from overseas to do supplier evaluations or manufacturer operate assessments or for technology transfers. So finding the kind of people you need in country to support those activities has been a real challenge with COVID.
Right.
Okay. Oh, so finally, we've talked a lot on the front end about supplier performance improvement. This was a case study that we were involved in, and it was really done in 2 parts. A consumer goods manufacturer was looking at an acquisition, and the acquisition target had an agent in Hong Kong and a subsidiary in China, and was bringing in raw materials from the U.S. And these were materials that could be for personal consumption, so ingestion. So you needed to adhere to GMP manufacturing requirements. They were bringing those materials in and doing final processing, packaging, and distribution out of China. East West came in to do some background due diligence prior to acquisition, and then to work with the suppliers following the acquisition to improve their performance. We did an assessment prior to the acquisition, number of deficiencies, quality control, and supply chain, and monitoring and measuring materials and how they're rotated through your inventory, and be able to track those raw materials were lacking. There were some business ethics concerns around dealing with customs agents in particular, and general legal compliance by the suppliers, and some failures and concerns around GMP and adhering to GMP processes, particularly around use of clean rooms. Next slide. So the client decided to go ahead with the acquisition, understanding there'd be quite a bit of work to do on the backside as far as supplier development. And we stayed involved in this and began to develop supplier performance improvement programs. And this was started out with ethics and business practice training, primarily concerns there. And then general just blocking and tackling around standard operating procedures, GMP practices, and some basics around statistical process control and Six Sigma processes to improve their quality and throughput. The results of that, within a year, taken supplier ratings from unacceptable to above average. Suppliers were regularly monitoring and reporting on their KPIs, and then measurement and SPC programs paid off by increasing throughput by 30%, and first pass quality was up over 40%. The resulting reduction in waste, spoilage, and efficiencies result in cost savings, very substantial cost savings of 15%, or about $3 million. So finally, as we wrap up, the right approach for your business is likely to be unique, but we've got a number of areas that you can look as far as maintaining competitivity in competitiveness in China going forward post-COVID. Anything from supplier development through organization design, talk about footprint optimization, or pursuing M&A targets. And we welcome the opportunity to talk with you if you've got an interest.
Dan, thanks so much. It is, as we promised, it's we're going to keep it right to our 1 hour. We look, if you're here in the U.S. or in China or Asia and you want to meet with it, come by our office in Shanghai, welcome to, and we'll send out a notice on the March webinar about specialty chemicals in Asia Pacific. But that concludes today's event. Thank you very much for taking the time.